Hey, and welcome! I hope everybody is having a really good NarraScope so far. It's cool to get to do this digitally still, so thank you to everyone on the NarraScope team for working so hard to put this together. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Kaitlin. I'm a writer and narrative designer at Capy Games. Previously, I was the lead writer on the death-positive game A Mortician's Tale, and I was also a team lead narrative designer at Ubisoft Toronto. I am a co-director of Dames Making Games, a feminist nonprofit focused on making games a safer place for marginalized folks to make and play in. But for now, I'm here to talk very nonchalantly about how to write and design text-based horror games that explore healing from trauma and lived experiences of mental illness. I want to start off with a content warning, since I will be talking about difficult things, such as eating disorders, depression, suicide, trauma, and other difficult topics. So stay safe and prioritize your health and comfort above all else. Okay, so text-based horror games about difficult emotions. That's incredibly specific, right? Because it's not just horror games, and it's not just text-based games, and it's not just games about difficult emotions, all of which are fully fledged talks in their own right and have a lot of thought behind them. But I want to talk about the hyper-specific world where you want to cram all three together, because that's what I do. At least, that's what I do in my spare time, and that's what I did when I first started considering myself as a game developer and making my own games outside of working with studios. My first game, called Stop Me If You've Heard This One Before, was a short story that I decided to try and break into a text adventure in Twine. I wanted to talk about my lived experience with an eating disorder, and I thought that not actually giving the audience any visualization of the protagonist was an important part of me actually being able to communicate what that lived experience was like, because it removed any of the focus on what the bodies looked like instead. The game itself is kind of ugly, and it's messy, and it's nowhere where I'd want it to be if I made it today, but it was the first thing I made on my own back in 2013, and it was really cathartic for me when I did make it. And then after that, I just really liked Twine. I liked making games in Twine, and I had a whole lot of bad feelings to work through, so I just kept making scary and gross games about sad things in Twine. I really liked making these games horror, not because people who have trauma or mental health issues are villainous or dangerous, as some mainstream media like to portray, but because living with trauma is often scary and overwhelming and it's isolating, and I wanted to be able to trade in the language of horror tropes to get the audience more on side more quickly. Horror felt closer to a lot of what my lived experiences felt like, and I knew I could use that language and tropes to better convey how scared and overwhelmed and alone I felt. So Stop Me, my first game, had this little pithy intro. Sometimes metaphors are more real than the events that happen. And while I was definitely thinking I was very clever and smart and profound when I wrote that, I wasn't just being pithy. I genuinely believe that. Metaphors are powerful for understanding, and being able to use established horror metaphors to talk about my pain let me focus on creating the experience that I wanted to. It's simple, but it's real. So all of that is to say, I started making games like this for a reason. And I do think it's important to come into making these kind of games very intentionally. I'll get more into that later, but creating with intention matters, especially when it comes to creating things compassionately and empathetically. Okay, so hi! Let's dig into how to create text-based horror games about mental health. So there are the three components. There's horror, there's text, and there's the difficult emotions. I want to talk about each of them separately first, because each part brings their own unique challenges. While horror games often focus heavily on visual representations of fear and terror to the player, text-based horror provides its own unique challenges, such as things like creating atmosphere, building tension, creating a pervasive feeling of terror, while still providing meaningful player agency. Making text-based games is actually really hard, as I'm sure most of you know. Also, from a workflow and team dynamic perspective, it's not majorly different from other types of collaborative game development. For text-based, the weight often falls largely on the writing, yes, but it also falls on your mechanics and your graphic design and your other skills. So even if you're working on your own and you're not actually collaborating with other people, you still might be borrowing skills from other departments. The horror part is also a challenge, and that's because getting that initial buy-in on horror can be really hard. People will either embrace being scared or they'll resist it. And then you add onto that challenge the fact that it's really difficult to design for fear. People are scared by different things. But that's not all. It's also really easy to miss your tone accidentally. What you think is a spooky monster may seem comical or campy to somebody else. And then, of course, horror is riddled with tropes, so you have to walk a tightrope of subverting tropes without falling into just being mindlessly tropey. And that's because making horror games is actually really hard. People want to be scared, but fear is subjective, and people will bring a whole host of layered emotions to it. If they're not afraid of what your monster or your core fear engine is, then it'll be harder to convey that fear through atmosphere, tension, and what have you. Horror is really difficult to design for because we feel it so intensely and we have an expectation for it on some level. We all know what it's like to be scared. Alright, and then we add on the difficult emotion part. Making games about difficult emotions, such as mental illness, have a lot of their own specific challenges as well, such as things like authenticity. Are you portraying this appropriately or correctly? Even the idea of what appropriately or correctly means is a whole conversation, and it means different things to different people. And then you have to think, are you being respectful of your subject and people who have also lived experiences with it? Spoiler, just because you experience a thing doesn't mean you can't hurt others who also have a similar experience or an experience that is different. Are you approaching this from a place of understanding and destigmatizing rather than inadvertently stereotyping? Like I said, we can still hurt other people, and this is why intentionality and empathy matters so much. So essentially, are you approaching this from a place of compassion first and foremost? That's the big one for me, because I think from a compassionate mindset first, then I have something I can measure my decisions against. And this is a hope because making games is actually really hard. And it becomes even harder when you add on to that the extra challenge of trying to compassionately talk about mental health and other difficult emotions. So since these are all questions and thoughts I've contended with a lot during my own process of trying to make games compassionately, I want to just talk through my process, and hopefully me doing that will spark some ideas for how to tackle this weird middle section of the Venn diagram that is this talk. Alright, so what does my design and writing process for making these sort of games look like then? A big thing for me has been trying to consider how to design for player agency that also comes from a place of compassion first, while also creating a space for terror. For my second game, There Are Monsters Under Your Bed, I wanted the player to feel like they were powerless, but they could find tools to help them to overcome that feeling. So Monsters is a game about being stuck in your room with monsters that you can't quite see. You know they're there, but you can't quite see them. So because I made this in Twine, for the clickable links, I used a flashlight-esque macro that highlighted individual characters within a word. I like this as a way of trying to convey exploration and navigation while also adding to the atmosphere of being in a dark place and trying to fumble your way out of it. Also, a question I asked myself was, if you were using a flashlight, would that make you feel more scared? Or maybe not necessarily more scared, but more like you're stuck and in a really dark place? I'm not sure, but that was kind of my hope with it. So I was hoping this flashlight macro could work as a way of letting the players know the game was on their side, even if fighting the battles was obtuse or it felt like there's no actual way to survive. I wanted my players to win, whatever winning meant for this game. There actually isn't a lot of agency in this game. It was still early on in my game dev career and I was still figuring out a lot about how I approached agency design, but I tried to offer tools that made my players feel like they could still navigate the darkness. So speaking of agency, I do intentionally try to pull back some agency at key parts in some of my games in order to try and properly pace the experience. Working with Twine's macros for timing text delivery became a big tool for me to try and control pacing. It's easy for players to rush reading a text-based game, and rushing text makes it harder to have players sit in an uncomfortable or scary moment. They want to get out of it. So slowing down how quickly the player could engage became a way I could start to try and create tension and also signal to players an important moment was happening. It works for atmosphere, for tension, for reveals, and all around is a fairly powerful yet kind of simple tool. So for my game, Halfway to the Lamppost, where this is a screenshot from, Halfway to the Lamppost is a game where you play as a woman, Caroline, both as an adult and as a child, as she's walking alone at night. I used time text a lot in this game. I really wanted to emulate the feeling of trying to be calm while you're growing more and more suspicious of the shadows around you. Like when you're walking alone and you're trying real hard to pretend that you're not scared of the dark, even though you super are. So I built a lot of moments that force the player to just sit and wait. And also for the intro, which is what you're seeing now, I deliberately told players that the scenes are timed to allow for the opt-in and to hopefully negate any frustrated feelings for if it took them too long to make a decision and they got pushed down a branch. Alright, so even though I am not a sound designer, I tried to use sound in really interesting ways in some of my horror games. Sound for me is an important part of creating atmosphere, but I never wanted to give my games an original soundtrack per se, and mostly because I am not musical in the slightest. So instead, I tried to zero in on atmospheric sounds. And halfway to the lamppost, I used crickets to signal when you were playing as Caroline as a child, and then no sound for when it was Caroline as an adult. The core of the game is Caroline as a child walking to meet her friend down the street from her, and there's this lamppost that's halfway between the two houses, and that's always their meeting point. And so you're playing as Caroline as a child walking down the street, and that was the part where I really wanted to convey both the familiarity of the situation, but also try to make it extra tensed. Then in comparison, the lack of sound for Caroline as an adult was used to show how empty and alone Caroline felt, and how very different those two kinds of fear were. Fear as a kid is so tangible and so concrete, whereas fear as an adult, to me, is more quiet, more existential. It's an overwhelming silence in contrast to the crickets that you have when Caroline was a child, kind of felt like the best way to convey that difference. Conversely, in my one game, One Night in a Haunted House, which is a game where you play as somebody awake with insomnia trying to get through the night, I tried to layer heartbeats to show her growing discomfort. I wanted it to build and to become more stressful, but by slowly building and layering, I established a language where this was the case and tried to not use sound for jump scares. Alright, so continuing the trends of things I am not, but that I try to get better at, is graphic design. I found that playing around with the text sizing can help contribute to things like tension and atmosphere. I tried to do this a lot in Lights Out Please to emulate different levels of anxiety. I wanted smaller text to invite the feeling of quietness, smallness, and larger text to feel overwhelming, perhaps claustrophobic. And juxtaposing the two meant to convey, and I tried to juxtapose the two in order to kind of convey an escalation between the different states. Okay, so that was more of the concrete part of this process. It's easier to design and test how effective sound and time text is. But next, I want to talk about this idea of compassionate design. This can be applied really to any kind of game, but it's an important philosophy for me when making games about a different subject matter, because it's so important for me to try and take care of my players while asking them to confront difficult topics. I can still be considerate even if players know what they're getting into with a game of mine. So for me, the starting point of designing compassionately is providing content warnings. This is the lowest hanging fruit and really should be the price of admission for making games of a difficult subject matter. I want my players to be scared, I don't want them to be harmed. So for Say When, I used a tiered content warning system. There's the base content warnings for the subject matter, but then there's the deeper one with more explicit details. Different people require a different amount of information to properly prepare themselves for an experience, so providing levels of information that are opt-in for content warnings was an easy way for me to immediately let my players access the information they needed in order to play safely. Creating choices for players that are learnable but not out of the gate gameable is another way I try to respect player agency from a place of compassion first. So in Halfway to the Lamppost, I was playing with this idea of Caroline's choices as turns in an encounter or a monster fight. She'd feel something around her, and she'd be able to react based on an emotion, rather than with an option like attack or defend, like I did in There Are Monsters Under Your Bed. With Halfway, I wanted players to make choices based on Caroline's emotions. So the options ended up looking the way they did because I was playing with cores, such as curiosity, fear, or indifference. If the player kept choosing the indifferent choices, then Caroline wouldn't be prepared mentally to fight the demon at the end. But if players allowed Caroline to respond with curiosity about what was scaring her, then she'd be more prepared for the final boss. As a side note, curiosity was a tool that I've used to combat trauma, and this is one of the biggest lessons that I've learned from going to trauma therapy, is to kind of confront triggers and experiences with curiosity, and that felt really important to me, and it was something I really wanted to imbue into this game. But I didn't want the choices to just say curiosity or indifference, because that felt like leading the witness. So instead I presented choices based on these emotions. Things like investigate the shadow, run to the next door, and ignore the shadow. Those are meant to kind of convey those cores. And I think you can kind of see which ones are about curiosity, like investigate the shadow versus the indifference. And my hope was that players could pick up on that and start to learn. To contain this all, a thing I really strove for was a way to tell a story that respects character agency as well. Even if I'm asking the player to inhabit a character, I still want the characters to feel like they have a sort of agency around their own difficult emotions. So in Say When, the game asks you to provide mods or to give advice to the main character. on ways that she can feel better when distressed. Here, I made it so the obvious feel-better suggestions didn't always equate to Lily's meter going up, because I wanted players to sit and think and try to determine what would be best for Lily as she was, rather than just rely on pat and unconsidered advice. And Lily will react how Lily will, not how the player expects or even wants her to sometimes. And this was the point. I wanted to show people that it's not your intentions that matter, but whether or not you actually listened to the person's experiences and were offering advice or support that they actually needed, not the kind you thought that they needed. So all of the above are things about how I hope to build a creator-player relationship that is safe, nurtured, and where players don't leave feeling like they were emotionally exploited or manipulated. Another way I approach this is how I handle plot twists. Most of the time, I hate plot twists if they are actually impossible to predict and feel entirely incoherent once they are revealed, especially if those twists contain imagery or ideas that are potentially triggering. Part of creating this trusting relationship between players and developers is letting players feel like they weren't got. Most good twists that aren't exploiting players should feel like they had the chance to piece that together themselves, but they didn't because it was cleverly handled. And the key here is that players shouldn't feel like they weren't clever enough, but because you as the designer were mega clever. This doesn't mean, of course, never add surprises or plot twists, but that for me, I just feel like they should feel character consistent and not world breaking, or like a complete violation of the player's trust. Players need to be able to opt into difficult situations, and to respect this player agency that is actually external to our game, we need to create an internal consistency that allows for them to prepare themselves and navigate it safely. And yeah, sometimes that means they need to be able to guess a plot twist before it happens. The kind of engagement, the kind that seeks to solve plot twists and uncover the hidden and layered complexities and interconnections, that type of engagement with our puzzle, systems, and imagery is core to interactive experiences anyways. So for my games, I try to lay the situation out at the beginning. This is horror, and it's about a tough thing, and then I don't try to exploit this trust by pulling the rug out unfairly from them at any point in the game. So essentially, designing these kind of games all kind of boils down to three things for me. Be compassionate, which often means you need to be considerate. Your story isn't more important than the person playing it. Respect them as an active part of the storytelling process, because they are. And very importantly, be intentional. Be intentional with what you're creating so you can use that intent as one of your core pillars. Hey, so that's it. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope hearing me talk about my process was helpful for anybody considering making games like this. I think they're super important, and having the space to share and talk about difficult things is really important for us as an industry and as in a community. So with that in mind, please feel free to connect with me afterwards. I'd love to chat about any of this kind of stuff. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your NarraScope.